Hi everyone, my name is Faiza, and join me as we talk about everything navigating the investment landscape with Zoey Dash Mckenzie. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. So for our viewers, could you just let us know who you are as a person?
As a person, wow, I mean, that's a loaded question. I'm Zoey Dash Mckenzie, and I am a new fund manager of Public Ventures, which is an early stage investment firm investing in life science and climate tech startups. And outside of my working life, I'm a mom of a 3-year-old daughter and, just an advocate and engaged citizen. So I spend a lot of my time volunteering with a pretty prominent hospital called the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, and, mentoring other founders and emerging investors.
Yeah, no. So what I heard was superwoman overall. Thank you so much for sharing that. Could you kind of delve in a little bit into your journey? What would you say is the most pivotal moment in your journey to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, looking back, I kind of feel like I've lived 9 lives. I started off doing modeling, so commercials and catalogs and all of that, and moved to New York to pursue a career in fashion. And very quickly realized that at the time of my move, technology was democratizing access to jobs. So a lot of the gigs that I started booking that I was booking during my career, I actually started going to influencers.
Wow.
So at that point, I started to be a little bit more curious about the tech ecosystem and made the decision to move back home and pursue tech as a second career, if you will. So I launched an app called Omni Messenger, which allowed people to schedule text messages to send at a future date and time or when entering or leaving any location. And to my surprise, even though I was having great traction, was nominated for Forbes 30 Under 30, I was really having a hard time navigating the Canadian ecosystem. And to be quite honest, I think, the Canadian tech ecosystem at that time was really in its infancy. So a lot of the incubators and supports that exist now just weren't around, 10 plus years ago when I was starting. So with that, naturally, a number of first-time founders or people curious about the tech ecosystem came to me because I was the only person that they knew that had an app in the App Store, and I took that as an opportunity to kind of spread the wealth of knowledge that I had accumulated on my own, open up connections, and started pretty much like a pitch competition and ecosystem for entrepreneurs to support them on their journey. Yeah. And through doing my own initiatives, that opened up other opportunities for me. So I had it was like a kind of wonderful moment to work very closely with The Weeknd and his team to develop essentially a creative incubator. So it's called House. Yeah.
House, yeah.
So, at the time, I just kind of leveraged all of the skills that I had and provided them insight in terms of how they could set up an incubator to support creative entrepreneurs. And then shortly thereafter, I was solicited by the CAMH Foundation to also do similar work supporting their doctors, scientists, and researchers who were becoming entrepreneurs.
Wow.
So that kind of took me on a journey to understanding the back end and mostly the finance side. And, naturally met a lot of incredibly talented founders, had the opportunity to invest in some of them. It just kind of took me on this journey to launching Public Ventures. So, I mean, there's an entire backstory to that. But that's kind of my story arc, if you will.
First of all, that is amazing. And I guess one call out, so I was actually one of a participant in Black House, actually. So I got to really experience that incubator as a whole. So I can imagine the ripple effect of the initiatives that you've partaken in, whether it's from an advisory role or just a general engagement sort of thing. So that's really phenomenal. And I was just curious. So you moved back, you made the decision to move back to Toronto, and you called out, like, you recognized a new industry, right? And you wanted to pursue that. And I can imagine for a lot of our viewers, there's that pressure of maintaining or staying in like one industry or one career path. Could you tell us a little bit about like your rationale when pivoting and like the skills that you had to acquire when getting into the industry?
Yeah, you know what? I don't think there was a natural kind of designed plan in terms of navigating everything. To be quite frank with you, I moved back, was living with my mom, single mom, and she was like, you need to get a job. If you want to do this entrepreneurship thing, then you're gonna have to go out and find work to support this endeavor. And I obviously benefited from making a lot of money doing modeling and it was getting residual income, but that wasn't enough from a Caribbean parent's perspective to kind of hold it down. So I remember making a conscious decision that even if my entrepreneurial dreams didn't pan out the way that I saw it, that I saw myself now through the lens of an entrepreneur. And I would apply an entrepreneurial mindset in every role that I took. So I remember my mom drove me down. If you're familiar with the GTA, I grew up in Brampton, and she dropped me off at Bramley City Center, and she's like, you need to write down a list of all the managers that you talked to and who you handed out your resumes to. And I was like, Mom, I can't work in the mall. Like, I'm on TV. Like, what are my friends gonna think and all this stuff. But anyways, I ended up getting a job at Pandora, which is a jewelry store. Yeah, jewelry store. And of course, it's like a glass box so everyone can see you working there, right? And while I was there, I was like, I just got a normal sales job, but I had this entrepreneurial mindset. So I was like, okay, where are there gaps and how can I bring my skill sets and my ideas to the forefront? And with that, I quickly set up a social media page for the business and, did a lot of really wonderful things. One of them including creating an express system for them. So if you know anything about Pandora, it's a very small business, right? So the square footage of the actual concept stores are very small. And at the time, they only had one point of sale system. So you would be in the mall, and on the days where they would have sales, there would be like long lines stretching around the outside of the store. And I was like, there's got to be a way to expedite this. So I used kind of my technical knowledge to create a back-end inventory system, and then got iPads and created catalogs with multiple charms. So guys who were in the lines and they're like, hey, I just got to get something for my girlfriend or my mom, they ended up purchasing a lot more because we positioned the packaged products in a way that was easy for them to purchase. We ended up doing over $1.2 million in sales in a weekend, and then I was quickly flown out by corporate to speak at their Miami conference and stuff like that. And at like a very young age, I was like, okay, an entrepreneurial mindset also helps me in the corporate world. So everywhere that I went, even if they were entry-level jobs, I applied that mindset, and it quickly allowed me to escalate in my career and access, I think, a lot of really good opportunities that set the foundation for where I am now. So that's like one example. And I also took a job when I had eventually moved back to Toronto and was bootstrapping my startup. In government, and it at first was just answering the phones. And then quickly, I moved throughout the government to becoming a policy advisor just by applying this entrepreneurial mindset, being curious, wanting to learn as much as I could and absorb everything and the access to resources within, the corporate or public sector environment. So I think like when I look back now, I'm able to connect the dots. I didn't really know what I was doing at that time, but working in government gave me the wherewithal in terms of how to set up these super cluster initiatives, which I was able to lend that expertise to house. So which is why they've created a very dynamic incubator program for creative talent. And likewise was able to apply some of the work that or the knowledge that I had acquired through government to my work with CAMH, which I can kind of get into a little bit later.
No, thank you for sharing that overall. So you've talked about the entrepreneurial mindset and like how you're able to apply it in like your day to day and the work that you were doing. Tell us a little bit about your journey as an investor. You kind of alluded to it a bit earlier, so walk us through what that was like.
Okay, so there's two parts. The first part was after I did my first pitch competition. I realized that, of course, there are a number of talented entrepreneurs here with amazing businesses, and I was doing everything to set the foundation to support them. And in a lot of ways, I was cutting myself out of these opportunities. And, I think that with a lot of people kind of coming to me saying like, hey, like, are you investing in these companies? What are you doing? Are you taking equity? And I was like, I could never take equity. Like, they're just in the beginning of their journey. It really encouraged me to think a little bit more about what that business and the business of investment looked like. So I started to educate myself, became a venture partner with a pretty prominent firm in Silicon Valley. And then because I really wanted to lean into the collaborative nature of investment, brought people in from my media and entertainment world in to invest with me. So I think I learned predominantly through doing. So I kind of discovered a couple of really amazing opportunities and essentially reached out to a few people in my network to see if they might be interested in supporting them and investing. And I kind of put together my first syndicate and had a really amazing mentor from the Valley help me to organize all of that. And then I've kind of been off to the races ever since. In regards to my fund, though, the investment thesis for Public Ventures is really a derivative of a policy initiative that I put together. So earlier I mentioned that I worked very closely with CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And during my time in working with the tech transfer office, we were developing programs and looking at different ways to be able to attract private sector capital to support the commercialization of some of the research that was being done there. And during that time, I actually, naturally met a lot of very incredible folks, but one of them was a standout to me. And it was a doctor who had actually developed a vitamin supplement that would minimize the symptoms for postpartum blues. Wow. So I was like, okay, wow, this is like amazing that it's being done like right here downtown Toronto. And I think I was in my early 20s, so I didn't really understand the impacts of postpartum, but I knew that it was like a severe thing that a lot of women experience. So fast forward to maybe about a year and a half after meeting him, a good girlfriend of mine is the first in our friend group to have a baby, and unfortunately she suffered from severe postpartum depression, was separated from her newborn for several weeks in order to get treatment. And I remember sitting in the hospital with her, just like in the back of my head, knowing that there was a treatment that could have potentially prevented all of this, that was having a hard time accessing the resources and the capital that it needed to accelerate. So for me, I was like, this is a fundamental human rights issue. Like, what are we doing? Especially because in the context of our research institutions, a lot of the scientific research is funded through public dollars, right? So that's the government grants and everything. So I'm like, we're the direct, investors, or the angel investors, if you will, the general public is. An innovation that we will never be the direct beneficiaries of. And that just didn't sit right with me. So I came up with a few different ideas in terms of how to attract funding and pull in some capital, and positioned it as in a business case to the foundation. And it kind of went up the chains. The CFO took a look at it, and some notes came back and said like, hey, this is great. However, there's a sticky rule in law called excess benefit transactions. Okay. So essentially it's like insider trading. Most foundations and the tech transfer offices work in the realms of philanthropy and with donors. So what this does is cause like a bit of a challenge in terms of sharing information about investment opportunities and providing preferential treatment to donors that could potentially benefit financially from having access to this information.
Gotcha.
So for me, I was like, okay, you've got the research center, all of these innovators working on wonderful projects. Foundation has a long list of donors with people who have money, means, and interest in supporting this type of work. Why aren't we doing more to broker these opportunities? Yeah. So leveraging the knowledge that I've gained through my work being a public servant in the government of Ontario, I was like, why don't we put a policy initiative together called the excess benefit exemption? So in the case where there is potentially life-saving innovation in the life sciences, climate, agri-tech, or some of these advanced technology sectors, that we should be incentivizing the donors to be able to put their capital towards, I would say the sciences rather than, your next consumer tech product. And then create a pathway for the tech transfer offices to meaningfully broker these deals. So essentially it kind of circulated within government, finance, and had some pretty prominent, folks in the financial sector based out of New York take a look at my policy memo. And then before you know it, I was sitting at the UN Science Summit sharing my policy with a global audience. So, I think that ultimately when we think about projects that are more scientific in nature, there's a lot of barriers to supporting their growth. And, some of the challenges with that are kind of identified and flagged through the policy initiative that I put together. But essentially, government legislation takes a long time to see any progress with. So I had a few folks kind of tap me on the shoulder and said, what about venture capital as a catalyst for the change that you want to see? And I was like, you know what, you're right. So I put my entrepreneurial hat back on and, really dug real deep into building out the fund. And we launched Public Ventures last summer. And, we've just been off to the races since.
Definitely off to the races for sure. Okay, so I heard a lot in that, and I thank you so much for just elaborating on that entire journey. Going back to what you talked about in the earlier parts of your journey as an investor, you talked about being able to quickly educate yourself and eventually becoming a venture partner for a Silicon Valley-based firm, correct? Yeah. Could you tell us about those bits of information that you acquired that came in handy when you became a venture partner and what that looked like?
Yeah, being a founder first, I think that probably anybody who is in the tech ecosystem has read Brad Feld's book, Venture Deals. And, that was kind of my first foray into learning about the investment ecosystem and mostly trying to educate myself in terms of what investors would be looking for from me. So that gave me, I would say, the foundational knowledge to understand what happens on both sides of the table.
Gotcha.
And then from there, I was able to apply those skills to, in the context of being a venture partner, really to basically educate the American investor base about the Canadian ecosystem and where there are opportunities here. So that was predominantly the work that I was doing with them. So just forging partnerships and making sure that there was deal flow from Canada going into the US and getting visibility there. And what I learned through being a venture partner was mostly the back-end operations of how to run an investment firm, how to do the due diligence, and kind of remove myself from it, because as an entrepreneur, it's very easy to get shiny object syndrome. So really looking at the mechanics of the deals and seeing how everything could be also financed in a way that aligns with the VC ecosystem. So I think that working with this firm gave me the operational wherewithal to understand how everything is orchestrated on the back end. And then that was supplemented by actually doing my own deals as a syndicator. So yeah, I would say that, putting myself in those environments obviously gave me the visibility in terms of how to build my own business without having to do it right away on my own. And then also gave me access to a huge network of investors and mentors. And, I think that I couldn't ask for a different story, right? Yeah. So it was kind of like perfectly orchestrated for my learning style and what I was doing at the time and everything. So.
And everything came in handy when it came to like starting your own fund eventually. Right?
Yeah, I'd already been doing the work in some capacity for years prior. So, when I got the tap on the shoulder to start my own fund, I was like, hey, like I already know all the things for the most part, right? So why not get started? So. Yeah.
And just speaking to like the network that you had access to just being in these spaces, could you tell us a little bit about what developing and building those relationships with the quote unquote right people, or just what the people in these spaces look like?
Yeah. So even though like I grew up in the performing arts, entertaining space, I kind of think of myself as more of a recluse. So getting out there and networking is not something that I'm like very excited to do. Yeah, it's probably one of the most challenging things for me is to like go out and be social and make new connections. I'm like the girl in the corner, just waiting for people to talk to me because I'm pretty shy in that way. So where I was able to kind of create leverage within my relationships was to always have projects or ideas that I was working towards or supporting other people with. So I would say that volunteering and working with CAMH allowed me to have real connections with people where they saw the validity of my work and my capabilities in a way that wasn't intimidating for me, and going to a bunch of networking events. And I think that because I naturally found myself in many spaces, so from entertainment and media, government, the tech ecosystem, I had a diverse pool of people that I could pull on, which always I think made things very dynamic when I would bring folks together for opportunities, deals. So it kind of very easily showcased my value add. So I would say that even though in this moment, when you look at, like, if you were to like write down all the people that you know that you could call, there might not necessarily be a direct alignment with what you're doing now. In 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, those might be the very people that will be the most influential in terms of whatever it is that you're doing. So for example, one of the first investments that I did was into a women-led startup. And it's an AI firm that's led by a IP lawyer. So essentially it allows people to search, register, trademarks without the need for a lawyer. So it's like your Google,
for IP.
For IP, And I had all these connections in media and entertainment. I'm now in the tech ecosystem. There's really wasn't very much overlap. But at that point, I'm like, oh, my friend is the VP at Viacom, and then this other person manages a bunch of influencers. And that was just like a natural way to be able to add value to a startup that was in that space that I would have never thought that there would have been like a complementary alignment between the people that I knew and then the opportunities that were coming through my door. So I would say, I don't know, I kind of went off on a tangent.
No.
I think that when you're building a network, it's important to just be as pleasant as possible to bring value.
You called out volunteering.
Volunteer and like put yourself in environments where you shine, right? I think that is the best thing that you can do. Like, just don't go out and hit up a bunch of networking events if you're not going to talk to people, right? It's kind of counterintuitive. So
I think it's so important that you called out the aspect of like being an introvert, because I think a lot of the times people look to entrepreneurs and leaders and kind of assume that like they're naturally just like extroverted, like they can interact with any and everyone, right? But then it's not like that doesn't come easy all the time, but then you find other ways to like show, like you find other aspects of your personality to like shine, which ends up becoming a benefit to like you and like the relationship that you build.
Yeah. So like it started off as like wearing fancy jewelry or a cocktail ring, and I'm like, and maybe someone will notice this and then come and talk to me and open the conversation. And then after I was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm not necessarily happening in these environments, and I like actually doing work and collaborating with people and breaking things apart. So why not volunteer and like have some of my own projects and reach out to people and get their feedback on things that were really tangible. And even if it was just like a project for play, it helped to open my mind and then forge a deeper connection where if somebody were to make a referral on my behalf, they would have something notable to say, right? So that was kind of my approach to networking.
No, thank you for sharing that. Now let's do a deep dive into public ventures, right? Could you share some of like the early challenges you experienced when trying to bring it to life, and then you can kind of share more about like actually having it up and running?
I will say that I was very lucky during my journey as an emerging fund manager to have supportive people who have been in the industry doing similar work for decades. So that was very different than my experience as an entrepreneur. So I was able to kind of, have a lot more access to resources and counterparts that I could bounce things off. The biggest challenge though for me wasn't necessarily in terms of setting up the fund or accessing resources and things of that nature, but it was really the premise of wanting to do something different in an industry that is set up predominantly to operate in the same way. So when you're setting up a fund, the life cycle or lifespan is usually about 10 years. So in the context of Canada specifically, when you're thinking about a life science fund, there hasn't been a new fund set up in the life sciences in over 10 years, with the exception of a government spinout. So for me, as somebody who is kind of coming as an outsider and having a different viewpoint in terms of how these types of deals should be funded, based off of what I saw working very closely with scientists, researchers, doctors in the tech transfer offices at some of these institutions, I was constantly challenged in terms of why I was kind of positioning certain investment deals or our thesis in a way that maybe is counter to the traditional way of doing investing. I think that is also perpetuated in some form based off of the ecosystem at large. So there are certain kind of barriers in terms of service providers on the periphery. So when you're running a fund, there are a number of third-party service providers that you rely on to do your back-end operations. Those are also businesses, and most of those businesses are developed in a way that allow them to scale. So when you're breaking away from traditional ways of doing investments, it usually doesn't fit their back-end models. So you can't work with some of the more well-recognized or established fund admins and things of that nature. Your costs typically go up, and I think that these are some of the considerations that I had to really make in order to stay true to our investment thesis and the change that we want to see. We are not a VC fund, we are an impact fund at our core. So in a lot of ways, we're democratizing access to early stage opportunities that really need to go through the pipeline, right? We're talking about innovation that is funded largely by public dollars that can actually transform the way that people live their lives. And I think for me, it's critical to think about the challenges for that particular segment of the market and build equitable pathways for finance that are solutions for that, as opposed to trying to, what do you say, like fit a square peg into a circle hole? Is that what's the analogy?
It's like you're trying to,
and yeah, I think that was the most challenging thing, but also the most rewarding thing, because for the folks that have, donated to some of these institutions, for the scientists that are working so hard to create innovation that could really create, just large scale progress and transformation for us as humanity. I think that it requires an entrepreneurial mindset from the VC landscape, right? I think that quite often a lot of fund managers have high expectations of their portfolio companies to be innovative and to be entrepreneurial and to be resourceful, but are not necessarily willing to do that same thing on their own, right? So when it comes to their business model, it's like, okay, well, this is the way that business has always been done. This is the way that deals are always financed. We use all of the same terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as opposed to how do we flip this so that we are actually a real partner to the people that we're investing in, and we're cognizant of the challenges that they're experiencing, and making sure that we're applying capital in a way that actually drives, a meaningful change and creates, I think, a more fair pathway to be able to have these types of companies expand, right? So I think that this applies not only in the sciences, but for marginalized communities as well, right? So there's a lot of things that, kind of go through my mind, and I'm like, you know what? Maybe it's going to cost more. Maybe it's going to be more challenging. Maybe there's less people that I can work with when I'm setting up the business. But if it means that I'm going to change the way that things are being done so that it can be more equitable and can create, I think, long-standing change, then it's worth it for me.
Yeah, no, you have to be audacious to see an existing system and be like, no, it doesn't have to work this way. We look at new ways of doing things. So could you just tell us a little bit about your approach with navigating that now or overcoming those existing systems?
Yeah, so I would say that, again, partnerships and working in collaboration are just a huge motivating factor for me, especially when you're working with early stage companies. Quite often you find that, maybe certain things as a company is progressing don't work out as well, or certain timelines get extended, or it's a little bit harder to fundraise given the ecosystem. So you want to have a really strong base of partners and collaborators that you can refer to so that you can get creative and create that extension. So, we've been able to work very closely with a number of tech transfer offices from some of the biggest and best universities and hospitals across Canada. And we're also, having conversations with folks in the US. So really looking at innovation kind of in its infancy, and finding things that can be transformative and funding them in a way that, benefits the tech transfer offices as well. So I guess, kind of going back to the earlier conversation about the policy initiative that I put together, in the absence of legislative change that allows a tech transfer office to meaningfully broker deals, what do you do, right? So you have to engage with the private capital markets. So what we're doing, the way that our fund operates, is we kind of sit in the middle of donations and grants and then the private capital markets, and we're bridging the gap there. So we found creative ways to be able to identify opportunities and fund opportunities to kind of pull them up the pipeline. So getting them investment ready as per the more traditional VC ecosystem. So I know it's probably a little technical in terms of, how we're doing some of those deals, but essentially we're bridging the gap over the valley of death.
I love that. I guess if you don't mind, could you share an example of with very minimal information, of course, of a deal or a company that you particularly work with to bring something like this to life, so that you can just expand a little bit on the nuances there for our viewers?
Yeah. I guess without giving away all the secret sauce, beyond most VC funds will just do direct investments, right? So they'll give some cash for equity. The way that we're doing things, especially because we're looking at innovation in life science, climate, and then particularly at the intersection of climate and health, is bundling early stage commercializable opportunities into a validation pool. So working with the institutions to kind of broker these joint ventures. So we're working in collaboration with them to help provide a bit of seed funding to get these projects that are on the cusp of breaking through to a point where they've hit a critical milestone that they're more desirable in the general VC ecosystem. So I think that's probably the depth in which I'll go without getting into the more technicalities of our investment tactics. But yeah, we're getting to deals earlier. We're able to broker deals that allow us to have some preferential access to the best innovation. And then really being supportive partners in terms of getting these kind of innovations up the pipeline. So yeah, I would say that that's kind of our secret sauce, if you will.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Figured for like our audience to kind of get a better understanding of the nuances. But I guess now with like staying aware or finding out about these different types of innovations, like what tools or resources do you and your team use to stay informed with like what's happening in the market and like the industry as a whole?
Yeah.
Especially for early stage, like really, really early stage projects or ventures.
Yeah. You know what? I think that you really have to spend time with the innovators and the scientists to get a really good sense and pulse in terms of what they're doing and how they're thinking about making changes or whatever discovery science that they're working on, and then applying a business mindset in terms of like how do you translate that research into a business, because sometimes that's the challenge, right? So we've got a pretty broad network of advisors that help to support us in terms of helping to bring that creativity to the forefront to say like, okay, you know what, in 5 to 10 years from now, this is how we see the world moving. And these are the types of innovations that are going to be needed to fill the gaps. So, if we think about climate and kind of the world on a whole, at this point in time, 1.3 billion people are living in poverty, and 75% of those are women, right? So typically, women are actually more susceptible to climate risks. So what does that mean when we're thinking about innovation that's going to support them as they're adapting to, heat disorders, or, it's very interesting in terms of some of the direct impacts that will be faced by women as the planet heats up, right? So really looking at how do we fill those gaps and help to find and fund innovation that, will essentially help the most marginalized and vulnerable people, knowing that obviously there's a much larger market available for them. In Canada specifically, 40% of our intellectual property is actually derived out of a hospital or university. And, I think that we have a lot of work to do to mobilize that and create great Canadian businesses. And, I think that it's just going to take us to be a little bit more entrepreneurial in terms of how do we translate this research into things that can create meaningful opportunities for change and, beautiful businesses, if you will. So, ultimately, it's really kind of looking with the end in mind. Our crystal ball has shown that, the climate crisis isn't going anywhere. So it's ripe for opportunities in terms of finding solutions that will be meaningful and transformative.
Our target audience for this are like people that are aspiring to be in positions like yours, right? And really equipping them with the technical skills, the toolkits, or I guess frameworks
Okay, so I think I've been asked this quite a lot actually in terms of how we see investing and how we are approaching it differently at Public Ventures. And we've actually developed our own internal impact framework called DECA. And essentially it has 4 distinct pillars that operate in collaboration with one another. So the first pillar, D, stands for deal. So are the deals mission aligned? So for us, it's really looking at things that can be transformative in the scope of life science or climate, or at the intersection of climate and health. The next pillar, which I think is often forgotten, especially in the Canadian ecosystem, is ecosystem. So can you create strategic partnerships where there are shared wins, but also shared risk? So when it comes to financing deals, are there ways that you can create, I think, more fair structures where the power dynamics are, I think, more aligned with long-term outcomes? And then the next pillar is community. So just thinking about innovation in action. So, are you working with the community to be able to get their inputs? And then what does that look like once your project is actually live? So I think that, in the context of, I would say, some of the table topics of the day, artificial intelligence, right? How much community input was put, kind of reinforced as these projects were being developed. And then what are the impacts when, all of these platforms are now leveraging maybe historical data to support artificial intelligence and its progress. And then the final pillar is really attached to the challenges for the climate crisis. So it's A, for application, and it's whether or not the intellectual property business model or business can actually be used in undercapitalized, remote or rural regions. So most of the climate impacts currently are being felt in the global south, but eventually it's going to start to hit home. So we might not necessarily die of malnutrition or malaria, but in the Americas, what the death projections, climate-related death projections are going to be based off of our direct impact, which is natural to see how, extreme weather event could affect, the most vulnerable. Then the next is actually cardiovascular disease. So that's heart and stroke disorders. And then the final piece is, for me, a little bit mind-blowing, but actually diarrhea.
Really?
Yeah. And when you think about death by diarrhea, there are a lot of things having to do with water and sanitation, and, the most vulnerable and susceptible to diarrhea are actually babies, right? So if you think about this in the context of children dying and that being what's trajected for us here in America, there's a lot of innovation that could potentially create a stopgap between, losing a child in the most vulnerable situations and being proactive about planning for how do we mitigate against the risks that we know are kind of heading our way. So yeah, DECA is just, for us, we look at the 4 pillars and figuring out whether or not a startup can actually implement through and through, and have they been thoughtful in terms of how they're building their business. So an example of one of the companies that we are investing in is a fiber science company. And the application of that is used in different materials. But the interesting thing is that they're actually taking plant fibers and then turning them, processing them into these new materials. And instead of working with bigger manufacturers that would actually pay them as a startup to get rid of their produce waste, they're working with local farmers and providing economic opportunities for the farmers to now make money, because they can streamline their processes as a startup, right? And get better materials based on the back end. So I think that when we think about DECA as an impact framework, it's like all the various touch points in terms of how a business affects society, and are we able to truly create positive impact for all of the stakeholders involved. So I would say that that's kind of our viewpoint in terms of what we're looking for, and also what we are expecting of the startups that we invest in, and also how we are creative in terms of supporting them, right? So Yeah.
As you continue to share this, it aligns more and more with you calling it an impact fund, public ventures, which is it's super enlightening and just super insightful. And just for someone that wants to get to this point to get investment from a public ventures or whatever, but feels very far away, like feels like they're not part of this industry, they don't do research or whatever. What is something that you would say to them to get started?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't let not being a researcher be a barrier, right? Because of the framework that we've put in place, we recognize that good ideas can come from anywhere. So if we really look at the community pillar, that might be a really good deal sourcing tactic for us, where people with lived experience have built projects to a certain point, but we have the benefit of having relationships with scientists that have the intellectual property or the ability to conduct research that could support the validity of a business or the broader scientific foundation of whatever that project is. So I think that in a lot of ways, we're trying to pull people together who want to create transformative change. So whether that's coming from the lab or coming from the community, being a broker and somebody who kind of marries the two is really what we feel like is our, true value add, right? And I think that just having somebody who is entrepreneurial at the helm of a fund like that, it's like, okay, well, I've been entrusted with the capital of investors, and how can I make the most of that by supporting all of these great ideas? Doesn't matter where they're coming from, right? So yeah, that's kind of our approach.
No, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so moving back into you as a person, you as a Black woman specifically.
Yeah. Hello.
So we hear a lot about the investment industry being predominantly male, predominantly white, and it is. It's not about just hearing about it being that. Could you share a little bit about some specific challenges or just biases that you've experienced and how you've navigated that, if you have anyways?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Like, I think that the biases, they do exist, and there are significant barriers. And I think a lot of the time, maybe it's easy for people to just try and put a label on someone and like, okay, you're a woman of color, or you're a Black woman, or you're this, or you're that, so you must do this, right? And I don't think that, at least in my story, that's not a natural translation, right? Like my fund, while we will invest in marginalized communities, is not solely focused on that, right? So I think that ultimately you have to understand that maybe people are going to see you in a certain way, but set yourself up to have a conversation where you are able to showcase other aspects of yourself. Yes, I'm a Black woman, but for whatever reason, maybe because of my upbringing, it's not the first thing that I think about in the morning, right? Like, I don't wake up and like, oh, like today I'm, a Black woman. I'm me, and this is, yes, a part of my story, and there's certain challenges that come with that, but also there's a lot of very unique advantages, right? There is lived experience that I can identify with, and I can forge connections with certain founders or partners. And of course, I've got a pretty dynamic backstory myself, where I'm able to leverage my past failures and successes to support the people that I'm working with. So I wouldn't say that you should let it be a barrier. And truthfully, there are a number of people who would classify under the majority that have been extremely helpful for me along my path. So it's nice to have some allies who are advocating for me. And also, I remember I went for breakfast with a pretty prominent angel investor, actually. And I remember he told me a story about somebody in his network, and he said, like, okay, I know this guy that I used to grow up with, and he wanted to be a math teacher so bad. And he's like, well, what made you want to be a math teacher? And he was like, oh, okay, like, well, there's this guy named Theodore, and he was like from Alvin and the Chipmunks, like, that was like really into science and math. And he was like, yeah, like, I actually, it's not from that show, but there's another show where there was a black professor on TV, and that was the only representation that I had of somebody in STEM, and that's who I looked to. And he sat with me and he's like, you are the real deal. And this is an opportunity for other young women to be able to see themselves in a way that maybe is only represented on TV. So I personally am going to do everything that I can to support you being as successful as you can be, because it charts a path for other emerging talent. So, I think that there are people in the ecosystem that recognize that they do have privilege, and they're willing to, offer access and support to make sure that, I think we're leveling the playing field. So that's something that always kind of stood with me. And, I think that I've benefited a lot from having some supportive folks, and I'm doing my best to make sure I also pay it forward.
No, that's very powerful, and like you are doing the thing now by uplifting different like ventures or people that are trying to have like meaningful impact. Pardon me. Can you share, so you, like while you were explaining that, you talked about some successes and some failures that you've experienced. Can you tell us a little bit about one successful failure, as I like to call it, that stands out to you in your journey, that's informed your approach to things today?
Successful failure. We all make mistakes. I would say, I don't even know if it was really a mistake, but the biggest whoops that I did was presenting this proposal for the excess benefit exemption to the foundation at CAMH, and then was quickly educated on why we couldn't do things in that way. And I think that a lot of people, myself included, like maybe had I not been so affected by what happened to my friend, that I would have kind of retracted and be like, okay, well, I don't know enough, and like, maybe this is not for me, or I shouldn't put my ideas forward. But I guess the best mistake that I made that ended up being successful was being okay with being wrong and just presenting a solution that didn't make sense, because I had the opportunity to learn from that and then propose an alternative solution that I think is relevant in the context of supporting research and development in Canada and around the world. And I would have never, in a million years, thought that would have been the path to my career now as a fund manager. So I would say that's probably been my biggest whoops, but happy accident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess going back to the story that you shared about your friend, one of the biggest things that tends to come up when it comes to investors, or the issues with the decisions that investors make when it comes to investing in a startup, is that lack of alignment or understanding in the problem or the experience that the startup is essentially trying to solve for. But you talked about your friend's experience. I was just wondering, what unique perspectives do you think Black women can bring to the investment landscape, just as a whole, whether it's with lived experiences, and I guess, how do you think these perspectives can benefit investment strategies now and in the future?
You know what? I think, you touched on it, right? Certainly there's a lot of lived experience where, we can lean on our creativity. Like, we've had to be resourceful for generations. And in a lot of ways that can be very beneficial, especially when you're supporting early stage companies. I would say outside of that, we're pulling on a huge network and ecosystem in the market that hasn't necessarily been considered when businesses are being built. So building for people of these diverse backgrounds also creates a huge economic opportunity, not only for the company, but for economic participation. So maybe that's other angel investors that are participating to help diversify cap tables. It's supporting funders of color and race and other intersectionalities. And then it's bringing businesses that can help people navigate their lives and, find themselves in a sea of products or services that really align with their unique needs. So, I think that that's one of the valuable things that Black women have and will continue to bring to the finance ecosystem. And, we just have to be more methodical about how we support them and making sure that we're also providing them with access to the resources and capital that's needed to carry them forward, right? Because, at the end of the day, money moves things, right?
Yeah, it does.
So.
And I guess when you say like being more methodical about it, could you just elaborate on what you mean there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that quite often, there's different types of investors or capital allocators that are making decisions about who to back, right? And quite often you'll find that maybe there will be a certain kind of investment policy put together, and you've got your checklist of what needs to, So you've got your checklist of, investment decisions that you're making when you're evaluating a fund manager or a deal or whatever the thing is. And quite often, if you're not able to check majority of those boxes, they will pass on you, right? And I think that in some ways there needs to be room for meeting people where they're at. So where can you kind of fill the gaps through creative finance or actually developing programs that support the acceleration of these new emerging fund managers, right? So in the context of, let's say, a fund of funds, potentially if they're investing in a new fund manager, or let's say you're an angel investor and you're wanting to become an LP with a new fund manager, it's like beyond the capital, how do you contribute to their success? Where can you pull in your resources, network, talent, et cetera, to support what they're doing in the absence of maybe them being able to kind of hit all of the check boxes. And once we start to think about people and really being equitable in the way that we make our funding decisions, then we'll start to see, I think, a better streamline of more diverse talent that also can stand the test of time, right? Because I think that quite often right now we're seeing a lot of DEI initiatives kind of flatlining, right? So it's like maybe we were able to hit the D, kind of the E, but maybe it wasn't inclusive because we didn't take into account all of this, the person's lived experiences, whatever their deficiencies might be, or also what their strengths are and how do we play to that. So that's kind of my thought process in terms of like, how do we change the power dynamics and actually be more collaborative in our efforts.
Yeah, and I think another key point, like I guess with these, like what you call that with the DI initiatives, there seemed to be this uptick of like bringing them to life, but then it didn't seem like there was this like long-term like strategic approach of like what are these like what will this ripple effect look like and what does it look like over a longer period of time as opposed to this present moment. But no, thank you for sharing that. So I guess all these things kind of come in hindsight, and just as someone that's been able to navigate this industry as a whole, could you call out just with looking back now, could you call out some technical skills that could contribute to one's success in this space or just in investing as a whole?
Like, I mean, venture math and like just general business economics are helpful, right?
What does that look like?
So like understanding how certain deals are structured and the key terms that are found in the agreements. And it depends on what stage of the investment cycle you'll be participating in, right? Early stage deals look a lot different than late stage deals and require, more technical acumen because these are the types of like late stage deals are typically on the precipice of mergers or acquisitions that require much deeper due diligence. So, I think that once you understand kind of the funding landscape and then understanding also where you have unique capabilities, or you can lean on your experience. Like maybe you did a degree in finance or something like that, and maybe you don't have some of the creative wherewithal to be able to navigate the early stage part and kind of identify really amazing deals, then you'll just kind of figure out where you want to slot yourself in. And then I think, outside of that, it's really just talking to people, right? Like businesses are meant to support humans, and largely, at least at this point, right? Maybe there'll be businesses for robots and other things after,
we're seeing
right?
That right now.
But ultimately, I think that if you have a pretty good sense of the world around you, the systems that are at play, who the stakeholders are, that will give you all of the baseline information that you need to be able to navigate things. And then outside of that, it's just finding ways to be adaptable, because you're never going to have all of the answers and know all of the right directions or decisions. Like there are, fund managers that have made a million mistakes, and I'm sure there's a long list of angels who've done things or missed out on deals that they wish they would have taken. So you're never always going to get it right, but it's like, how do you always find a way to navigate and learn and grow, and then apply that learning to be able to support not only your own growth, but the growth of all of those around you.
No, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I guess with all that in mind, and also what you called out earlier about recognizing a structure that doesn't necessarily change, or what you mentioned about how, with regards to like the investment landscape, or the way deals are structured, it's a traditional approach. It changes every 10 years.
The investment landscape has largely stayed the same, and the way that deals are done have, for the most part, stayed the same for a very long time.
Yeah.
And, as with any change, it takes a lot of time, effort, support, in order to see that be long-standing. So I think that once you understand that, like, hey, this is the way that things are set up, am I going to fight the system, or am I going to play within it? That is the game changer, right? So, for me, I could have probably fought really hard to see some legislative change, but a workaround was starting a fund that also supports these types of startups in a meaningful way. So I think that ultimately that's something that anybody can carry with them, is just knowing that, yes, there are going to be problems, there's going to be challenges, not everything is going to be perfect, but there are meaningful ways to be able to find workarounds, and then also a network of supporters that also probably lean into your way of doing things as well.
No, absolutely. And I guess with that in mind, like, what are your thoughts on the future of investment, like the investment landscape?
Well, I'm hoping that more people will lean into the DECA framework. I think that it will be a huge game changer. I believe that, as we face more complex global issues, there is going to be a higher affinity to supporting the sciences, and innovation that is backed by rich intellectual property, which is, I think, a really strong attribute of the Canadian ecosystem. So, I think that people are going to be looking to Canada to solve some of these very challenging problems, and a lot of businesses are going to be built here. And then we're going to see a diverse community, because Canada is diverse on a whole, at the helm of a lot of these new businesses, funds, and investment opportunities.
No, thank you for that. And I guess to like wrap us up today, what is, for our audience, what is one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self, given everything you know now today?
Okay, so looking back, if I were to speak to my younger self, I would have told myself to trust the process more. Entrepreneurship, or like just doing anything that's outside of the scope of what you're used to seeing, is very challenging. And I remember just wanting to be normal so bad. I was like, why can't I just get a normal job and just be happy with, like, you know, kind of the bare minimum, so long as I'm doing better than my parents did, that's good enough. I don't have to do this big transformative thing. But there was always this little voice inside of me saying that, like, hey, there's a lot of potential within you and you have to lean into that. And it was really scary. But overall, if I was more accepting of my own, I guess, divine path earlier, I wouldn't have been so hard on myself as I was navigating entrepreneurship and getting to where I am, because ultimately, you know, it's led me to exactly where I need to be.
That was very, very well said.
Yeah.
You've taken us on the journey, and we probably only got to see like the surface or hear about the surface. It's a little dot, but it was an absolute privilege and just an amazing conversation today. So thank you so much, Zoey. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you.